gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the University of Southampton, to the Faculty of Medicine here in the heart of University Hospital Southampton. My name's Lucy Green and I'm a scientist from the Faculty of Medicine and your chair this evening. A warm welcome, really warm welcome to all of you, members of the public and young minds from colleges across Hampshire who are with us today, and also colleagues from the university and hospital. Well, you know, the title of this evening's question time is Toxic, and I suppose we respond to the world around us from cradle to grave, actually before we get to the cradle, when we're unborn babies inside our mother's wombs. When we're developing, we respond to the air that's breathed, the food that's eaten, the water that we bathe in or even drink. And we're ingenious, aren't we? We're constantly finding new ways to make our lives easier and better. Plastic water bottles to carry our drinks in, drugs to cure diseases, quicker ways to travel, quicker ways to grow crops. But there's a price to pay for this success, isn't there? We've got microplastics in the sea, organic pollutants, air pollution, drugs appearing in our water system, and you can't fail to notice on a daily basis the media coverage of our changing climate. Our ingenuity is upsetting our bodies, but it's upsetting the world around us, and the two are interconnected, are they not? We're under assault, I suspect, from the very earliest stages of development. Tonight, we've got a fantastic panel of experts assembled here to really discuss their ideas on quite how toxic things have got for our bodies and our health. And they're ready to take your questions and discuss some of the really thorny issues. Dr. Simon Boxall is an oceanographer and supreme communicator from the University of Southampton, and he knows firsthand of the damage that's being done to our oceans. Professor Boobis from Imperial College is a toxicologist who spent many years working and advising on air, land and sea pollution. Someone who spends his time thinking about how young bodies respond to toxins is Professor Graham Roberts, a medical doctor and research expert in childhood allergy and respiratory medicine. And researching the complexities of our behaviour, particularly young men and women, towards food, the environment and their health is Professor Mary Barker, a psychologist and behavioural scientist from the University of Southampton. Now, Professor Barker and colleagues from the university are keenly focused on the power of young voices in making changes to the environment and health for the benefit of generations that follow. And so it's a great pleasure to also welcome onto the panel Shante Jackson, who is an A-level student from Itchen College. And we've got some of your colleagues here in the audience tonight. I don't know, where are you? There you are. Hi. But she's also Southampton's member of Youth Parliament and has a great passion for making positive social changes in the city of Southampton. So welcome to you too. And finally, putting the science and the policy into practice at a local government level is Dr. Debbie Chase, who is Public Health Service Lead Officer and Consultant in Public Health at Southampton City Council. Welcome to you all. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
You can, if you like, tweet about the event using the hashtag and let the world know you're here. And we will be taking comments from the audience, so stick up your hand and take your chances in the middle of this session. But I think to get the proceedings started, we should take our first question from Miriam Halls of Peter Symonds College. Miriam, where are you? Have we got Miriam in the house? There she is. You've got a microphone. Stand up so that the world can see you.
So during our daily lives, we're exposed to many contaminants. What do the panel think is the greatest environmental toxin threat to humanity in the next 10 years?
Wow. Well, you know, I'm going to go straight to Shante Jackson, actually. Shante, what is the thing that we should be most worried about, in your opinion?
Oh, okay. So for me, I believe air pollution is definitely the biggest thing that we have to worry about. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen like a great rise in pollutants going into the atmosphere, and obviously with our dependence now on cars, with the more usage of planes, with cruise liners, we definitely have more pollutants in the air, which are going to lead to respiratory problems later in life and cardiovascular problems, things that we need to be looking out for.
So big issues here. I may, if I ask Alan Boobis, what your opinion is. I mean, you spent a good number of years working in this domain. What's your biggest concern and threat, do you think?
I would tend to agree with the last response. You know, if you think about the global picture, not just one country at a time, I think air pollution levels are the thing that we've failed to get under control in many parts of the world. And even although we have fairly strict levels in Europe, for example, most places are exceeding them. And we are aware, and unlike many situations, we actually know where most of the pollution is coming from. So it's a tractable problem if we're prepared to address it. In other words, vehicular transport is an obvious problem of generating pollutants. There's a trade-off, but we have to think about how can we deal with that and reduce the atmospheric pollution that we're exposed to.
Interesting, thank you. Does that marry with your opinion, Simon Boxall?
I think it does. I think if we're looking at air pollution, you can also look at water pollution. And I think one of the key things is, as Alan was saying, that it doesn't matter that we clean up our act. The atmosphere and the oceans know no boundaries. And so if we've got problems in other parts of the world, that's going to affect us anywhere we are. So, you know, we may find one country is performing perfectly well, but then they're affected by neighbouring countries or countries the other side of the planet. And as I said, many of these toxins don't actually realise they're not supposed to cross political boundaries. They don't have passports.
Yes, in air and sea.
In air and sea,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Graham Roberts, do you have anything to add into this?
I wonder if we've been rather blasé about pollution for the last few decades. If you go back 100 years in the UK, apparently our cities were covered in smog. No longer happens. You go to visit Beijing, parts of India, you see smog. And because we can't see pollution, I think we thought actually it isn't really a problem. But actually now we really understand what happens in terms of small particles. I don't know if my microphone is working or not. Definitely coming back at me. Now we understand what's going on. So actually there are very small particles, sort of less than 10 microns, definitely less than 2.5 microns, that actually will get right into the bottom of your lungs and will go straight into your blood, straight up to your brain and across your whole body. And so pollution that you can't see, you breathe in and is very rapidly affecting all your bodies. And
so pollution you can't see, okay, the hidden
exactly,
threat.
Exactly, and that's what we haven't realised until the last decade.
Yeah, interesting stuff. So, Mary, Debbie, do you have anything? What are your opinions? Yeah.
Well, it's all terrifying and truly shocking, the full realisation of all of this. But what really interests me is what it takes to stop us. I mean, if we are the major cause of this pollution, how bad does it have to be to stop us? And is it about frightening the living daylights out of us? Is because we know that being very frightened is not always a good way of changing our behaviour. Quite often that leads us to just, bury our heads under the duvet and pretend it's not happening. So I'm quite interested in asking Shante, which is possibly mean, but what would it take to stop us doing
I'm going to stop you here because we will move on to this, but stick with the question if we may, which is, what is the biggest threat? What is the biggest worry?
Well, we are.
We are. Okay, we'll park that one and come back to it, I think. Thank you. Debbie, what is the biggest threat to humanity in the next 10 years?
I've got to agree. So if you look at the Public Health England strategy nationally, it's fantastic to see for the latest strategy and over the next 5 years tackling air pollution is identified as one of the core priorities, alongside ensuring that we exercise, we've got a good diet, smoking cessation, mental health, and giving children the best start in life. So those are the top priorities nationally. There's a strong evidence base in relation to air pollution and impact on health, from the womb right the way through to later life. We know that it's incredibly strong in relation to respiratory health and cardiovascular health. So from an evidence-based perspective, absolutely, it has to be air pollution. Although I'd like to add to that how difficult it is to look at the evidence base in relation to environmental factors and the influence it has on human health. So there's a lot of stuff that it's really difficult for us to quantify the impact that it has. The other thought I had in relation to your question, we're talking 10 years down the line. For me, if you look 20, 25, 50 years down the line, climate change really worries me. And there's a lot of work that's being undertaken in Southampton, particularly to ensure that tackling air pollution is part of a wider green city agenda, because the air pollution is one part of that agenda, and equally, from a public health perspective, we know active transport is going to help us reduce obesity as well, and it's a core part of reducing air pollution.
Thank you. Now, has that answered your question? I think it's, given the way that this discussion is moving, I think we should move on to our second question from Felix Mills of Barton Peveril, because I think this will now pick up on a couple of the points that the panellists have raised. Felix, are you around? There you are. Brilliant. Do you want to stand up so the world can see you?
So, whose health is affected the most by pollution, climate change and toxins?
So, whose health is affected the most by these factors? Graham.
So I had a feeling you might be coming to me. I think that it's people at risk, and those who are at risk are those who already got respiratory problems. And so I'm going to have to say asthma, asthma and asthma. If you've got an inflamed airway, you're at risk of wheezing. You don't need much irritation of your lungs for them to close down, and you're in hospital. So it's those who've got pre-existing respiratory problems. The older age group, which I don't look after, so elderly with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is very similar in some ways to asthma. Again, they will have exacerbations that are triggered and made worse by pollution. And there was some interesting data published earlier on this year where hospital admissions for these diseases were tracked. As they went up, they went up as pollution went up. Pollution goes down, they go down. So there's a very, very strong correlation.
Thank you. Debbie Chaser, may I come back to you a minute and pick up on something you said a minute ago about, I think you mentioned unborn babies in there somewhere in your point. Who do you think is hit the hardest by these environmental factors?
Absolutely, as we've been talking about, people who have existing health problems, but equally, if we think of the development of a child and in the womb, then clearly we're more vulnerable at that stage in life, so it's going to have a bigger impact. The other aspect of this, from my perspective, is thinking about deprivation. So people that are deprived, have less resources, tend to be the most vulnerable in our population as well, and get exposed to a lot more, for instance, air pollution, and yet are less likely to own a car. So there's a social injustice challenge there as well.
Yeah. It's yeah, absolutely. Mary, can you add to this?
I can always add to. I always have an opinion, you know me. That's why I'm here, right, Lucy?
Absolutely.
I mean, what that makes me think about is the effect in low and middle income countries, where all of those factors are kind of concentrated to a great degree. And actually, we sit here, and yes, of course, asthma is hugely risky for many people, but we shouldn't forget that actually there are large parts of the world where these problems are enormous and dwarf any of the issues that we experience in this country.
So a real geography issue, and absolutely. Alan Boobis, from your experiences sitting on advisory panels in this regard, what do you see as the biggest health hit? Who's hit hardest?
Well, I don't think there's a single answer to that.
Okay.
If you talk about the world of toxins and toxicity, and even if you look at air pollution, there's no single answer, because air pollution itself causes more than respiratory problems. It's been linked to an increasing number of disease entities, cardiovascular obviously, but also now neurodegeneration and reproductive and developmental effects. The other thing to remember is that you may not be hospitalized just because you've been exposed to air pollution. It may have contributed to other risk factors. So we've had to look at it as all of these exposures are additional risk factors. So for somebody that might push them over the edge and give them a disease, for somebody else it might add to other things. So if you think of lifestyle issues, obesity, for example, that is going to make you more susceptible to other factors. So again, you've got another population. So even I absolutely agree that the social deprivation is clearly a huge risk factor. But at the other end of the scale, people who are living very luxurious lifestyles and eating and drinking too much may also be at risk from these exposures. So I think we need a holistic approach to addressing this.
Simon Boxall, how does this relate to the beasts in the ocean and the health of the beasts in the ocean in relation to our health? You know, we can't ignore this.
Are they being as affected as much as we are? I think I would agree, first of all, Alan, that we all are impacted in some way by toxins. In terms of the oceans, then we are seeing quite a big impact in terms of DDTs, in terms of PCBs, in terms of a whole series of toxins that go into the oceans. We tend to we ban DDT. And yes, okay, we're not seeing that on our crops, we're not seeing that in our land use these days, but it goes somewhere. And actually the lowest point on the planet is the ocean, so it goes into the ocean. So you've got this big build-up in the oceans of these toxins, which we stopped using years and years ago, we hope, but are still going into the oceans. They're still there in some numbers. And of course, animals, particularly marine creatures, will tend to concentrate those toxins. They accumulate those toxins, particularly if they are filter feeders, and that then works its way back into the food chain. So we might get rid of DDT 20 years ago, we might well see it coming back through the food we eat from the oceans. So it has an impact, and we are seeing more and more extinctions going on in the oceans as well. The problem is we don't know half of what's there. We've probably lost a big chunk of it already.
That's frightening stuff. Shante, I'm not sure whether you have anything to add to this.
Yeah, just to echo the words of Debbie and Mary, definitely from a social point of view, it does seem those from either low-income families or developing countries around the world are going to be paying the highest price, even though they tend to emit less emissions than the rest of us. So it's definitely important to take into consideration those.
Thank you. Felix, does that answer your question? Where are you? There you are. It does. How does the rest of the audience feel about this? Does this marry up with what you perceive to be the biggest health problems? And anybody please do feel free to stick up your hand and make a comment at any point. So if not, then we will move on. And also, if any knowledgeable experts in the audience wish to comment on the biggest susceptibility in their line of work, please do add to the discussion as we go along. If not, then we will move on to our next question, which is from Ollie Morris of Brockenhurst College. Ollie, you're here right in front of me. Can we get you a mic?
Do the panel think that food should be labelled like medicines are?
Do the panel think that all food should be labelled like medicines are? Mary, can I ask you?
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
No. I don't think it should be, because food isn't medicine. Food has so many other meanings for people, and food is not all about health, as many of us who work in this area, who are all sat up there, would agree, I hope, is that the food we eat for all sorts of different reasons, and it does a whole load of things for us that are not just about medicine. And I'm very interested in why you'd ask that question. Am I allowed to ask the question back, Lucy, or are you going to tell me off?
We can interrogate him. That's fine. I imagine this is stemmed from some of the massive media coverage of people kind of responding poorly to food in a negative way. Is that really where you're coming from with this?
No, I was just curious.
Just curious. Yeah. In that case, I will, though, picking up on that theme, turn to Graham Roberts, actually. What is your feeling about this?
So I completely agree
As a
with
doctor of
Mary.
allergy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, there's a but. I mean, no, let's come to, I mean, you can't medicalise food, it's food. But if you've got a food allergy, you have to know what you're eating. Otherwise, you are walking on a tightrope and you will fall off. So although you can't medicalise food, it's really important that the food we buy, be it a supermarket, be it a cafe or whatever, is properly labelled. So if you have a food allergy, you know what you're eating.
So, I mean, in that respect, do you view that you know, in those scenarios, that food is effectively a toxin?
Okay, so a food can be a toxin to you if you've got allergies, and you've got a right to know what's in that food.
But we're presuming that you're talking about food that's processed in some way.
Yeah, I mean, if you go into a market and you're buying some vegetables in the market, perhaps it's been stored with another food, and it's got contaminated. So, not necessarily processed. Any food, you want to know actually where it's been, and are there potential impurities or products that shouldn't be there, and they may be your classical toxins, or it may be the peanut that I love eating, but a lot of my patients will not go anywhere near for very good reasons.
I mean, is this the most allergic generation ever? And that hasn't come from me. This actually comes from some of our students that visited us last month at our institute, and they actually were musing on this in their discussion groups.
Okay, so I gave a lecture to a master's group of students a few weeks ago, and I was asked, has food allergy increased? And I went back to the data, and actually the data are rubbish, and you can't prove it. So if I was in a court of law, I couldn't prove the point. I'm pretty sure, though, that actually there are more allergies around today than when I was in medical school 25 years ago. It's why? Well, that's a separate answer, but yeah, I think you'd be challenged to find anybody who wouldn't agree with that statement, at least in the UK. If you go to other countries, so we did a study where we're looking at food allergy across the whole of Europe. We were very busy in the UK diagnosing food allergy. The Greeks were on the beach doing nothing because they couldn't find very much, if any, food allergy. And what's going on there?
Oh, I thought you were going to tell us. I was all excited.
I want to bring in Alan Boobis, yeah.
I'll make a specific comment on allergy and then more general comment. So there was a view in this country and some other countries that early exposure of babies to food allergens was a really bad thing. So mothers scrupulously avoided exposing their kids earlier in life, I'm talking about the first year, to allergens like peanut and egg. It turns out that was probably the worst thing you could do. There's now good evidence from clinical studies that suggest that early exposure actually helps avoid some of that allergy. So that may be one factor. And getting the advice right is really difficult because a lot of the data is not very good at all, as you say. But in terms of labelling food, I mean, you know, the UK has got a sort of traffic light system because the idea is that we can give nutritional advice to people through saying things, well, this contains a lot of salt or this contains a lot of sugar. And we're not saying that salt or sugar is necessarily bad for you, but you have to think about how much you're consuming. So this allows the consumer to judge how much they're getting. So when they read something which is red for salt, they know it's got a lot of salt in it. We have to put onto the packet all of the additives that are in food already. So people can make informed judgments as they want something which contains artificial colours or additives in it, or sweet or flavourings.
We're not going to go down the route of, surely, of having like an insert in there with all the contraindications and the portions and...
Not the contraindications, but you can Google the web and see what does aspartame do. I don't advise it, because 95% of what you'll find is rubbish.
Does that answer your question? Yeah. Is there anyone else you'd like to hear from around, on the panel on this? No? Is there any comments? There's a hand up over there. Yeah. Do you want to just... Yeah, I shall sprint down with you, the microphone.
Would you say if you labelled food much more like medicine, it would reduce the increasing levels of obesity?
Now, who are you asking here? Graham Roberts?
Yeah, that's
good.
Sorry. Personal opinion, no. I think this is more of a Mary question, though.
And I completely share that opinion. No. Why would it?
I'm maybe just more food conscious. So like you're saying with the traffic, like the earlier comment about the traffic light system, people are more conscious if when they see like the whole thing's red or something, it's more like food for thought. So they're like, they see that this is like good for the body in some way, or like they're seeing that it's maybe not as good. So it's giving more people awareness, because like in like areas of deprivation, they have no education on food, and like people from like a better background, like they have the education on food because they've been access to it, but in deprivation they haven't. They've like been brought up eating certain foods and have no awareness of it. So if these were like wrapped like medicines, maybe they would like be able to be like, oh, even though I haven't had the education at home, I'm able to do it myself because it's right in front of me.
Well, what's really interesting is that when you ask people from all over the place, from all different parts of Southampton, if you ask them about food and what makes them eat what they eat, and you ask them about food and health, and you ask them what they think they should be eating to be healthy, pretty much everybody from wherever they come knows that you should be eating fruit and vegetables, for example, and that you probably shouldn't eat 20 packets of crisps a day, and that you probably shouldn't drink fizzy drinks and nothing else. So I think just the knowing stuff doesn't seem to do it for us, because I suspect a lot of us here know that we, crisps are my particular problem. And so I was talking to myself, and I know that I shouldn't eat crisps because crisps are really, really salty, and it says on the packet how salty they are, and it says exactly how dreadful they are for me, and I still absolutely love crisps, and I eat crisps much more often than I should. So there is a bit of a problem with the whole reliance on just telling people what's in their food as a way of helping people manage what they eat, because that's not really why people eat what they eat quite often. I mean, you and I could sit down and have a really interesting chat about this, and we could have a chat about everything you ate today, and I suspect not many of the choices you made today, and I'm not being personal, but not many of the choices you made today would necessarily be just governed by what was good for you, or you'd even be that much aware of what you'd eaten today. Because the idea of putting information on food packets rather assumes that we're very conscious of what we eat, and an awful lot of people, a lot of us, me included, are not very conscious of what we eat. We make a lot of food decisions that are triggered by all sorts of things around us, like the fact I've just eaten an entire bowl of tortillas. I don't even like tortillas that much, actually, but they were really nice. So information is really not the answer, I'm afraid. It's much more complicated than that, and now I'll shut up.
No, that's good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other comments there? Yeah.
I actually have an intolerance myself, and maybe to address those with a more political sort of slant on the discussion, there was actually a case a few years back where a girl died because she ate sesame seeds that weren't labelled by a very big company. And it's not just big companies. I find myself going into cafes and things, they quite often can't provide ingredients or be able to say for certain what does and doesn't contain allergens. Do you think there should be maybe more rigorous processes around labelling food allergens?
Who are you asking?
I guess any of the more interesting...
Debbie, do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yes, I do. I think there's different levels at which that can be done. So I'm thinking at the moment in Southampton we've got a childhood obesity scrutiny inquiry. And one of the things that was raised at the first meeting was the importance of better labelling within restaurants and cafes across the city. So we can do a certain amount at a local level through the local authority, but there's also national policy requirements as well. So things would have to happen at different levels, Food Standard Agency, powers. I'm not familiar enough about how we would make that happen at a national level, I'm afraid. But I think you're right. There is a need for more information to support people and inform them in what they're eating.
Thank you. We're going to move on. I think this could constitute an entire half an hour discussion, actually, but we're going to move on to our next question from Annabel O'Sullivan of Portsmouth College. Annabel, are you out there? There you are. Stick your hand up. There we go. There she is. Hi. She's here. Blonde hair. Would you stand up? That'd be great then. No? Okay, don't then.
As an individual to reduce my exposure to toxins, or is it down to the government and big industries?
I'm going to go back to Debbie here, actually, to kick us off. Is that okay?
Yes. Oh, there's so much in that question, and I won't be able to answer it well enough, and I'm sure people will answer it better than I. I think there's things we can do. There's things we can do within our households, within our communities. There's things that the local authority can do, the businesses can do at a national level and international level. So it's almost like Russian dolls. We can all do something to reduce our risk. There is increasing evidence of things we can do. There is a developing evidence base. I'm thinking particularly about indoor air pollution at the moment and the impact and the effect of different pollutants within the house, your cleaning products that you use, the various what you buy in terms of your foods. But then there is a role for local authorities in terms of policies and then at the national level. So I think it needs to be what they call a system-wide approach to make it work. Everybody has a responsibility.
Shante Jackson.
I agree. I think you do need individual change and system change as well. Obviously, the government will be able to play a part with the pollution and toxins in the air, things like airport expansions, obviously, more flights, more passengers, it's not going to have a good effect. As far as the individual, obviously reducing your own pollutions and like the emissions that like your own carbon footprint, maybe by cutting out meat from your diet, obviously it's not going to straight away affect you, but for the whole global atmosphere.
Thank you. Simon Boxall, from your perspective, in the deep ocean.
The deep ocean. Well, just in the deep ocean, the shallow ocean as well. Yes, you can make a big difference yourself. And I think individuals have a responsibility to make a change. But actually, ultimately, it's not down to that, because you might make a change, but if your neighbour doesn't, then not sort of burning smoking fuels and things doesn't help at all. And I think ultimately it comes down to not just national governments, but international governments. As we said earlier, the oceans, the atmospheres don't appreciate boundaries. So until you do a worldwide ban on things, good example, there are plenty of good examples, lead in petrol. We used to, believe it or not, put lead in petrol. Really stupid idea. And it took government legislation across the globe to ban lead in petrol. At the time, everyone said it could never happen, cars would break down, the oil companies said we can't produce petrol without lead in it. They did it, and actually, if you think about it, if you live near the roadside, it comes back to social deprivation. If you live near the roadside, the chance of getting brain damage because you lived near a place where lead was being poured into your body, not a good thing, was a really bad thing. But individuals couldn't turn around and say, I'm not going to have leaded petrol. It took governments to say, we're going to ban lead in petrol. And it worked. It's not an issue anymore. And it's the same with many things, CFCs and so on when it comes to ozone layers. Again, it took a worldwide ban on these things. Microplastics in cosmetics, it's a worldwide ban that is now actually meaning we're seeing a reduction in microplastics or microbeads going into the oceans. So it takes government initiatives to make those differences, and industry will follow. Industry is very good at getting around the problem. They built cars which didn't break down because there was no lead. They produced petrol without lead, and it works fine.
Alan Boobis, do you have anything to add to that? Those ideas?
Well, I agree with much of what's been said, but I would make another point, which is it's very easy if we live in the modern world, reading the newspapers, the social media, watching television, to believe that we're being bombarded all the time by a vast array of highly toxic chemicals. This is not true. It's not true at all. And so I think that to make an impact, so for example, I absolutely agree we should be doing something about air pollution. And the ban on lead was a really good public health move. But there are things that we read about at the moment where we're exposed to trace levels which people would have us believe are really harmful to us, and you could, if you wanted to avoid them, you would live a life which was almost impossible. And I think you would die from stress before you died from exposure to that chemical. That's the reality. So I think that it's about looking at getting trusted information and making a judgment for yourself as to what is it that really matters and what doesn't matter so much. And think about also, as has been said, what are the national and international initiatives that could have a real impact and improve health.
Yeah. So, thank you.
I mean, just to finally say, for example, the evidence we have is that the water we drink from domestic water supplies in our country is extremely toxin-free. It's very, very low levels of toxins. It's very carefully monitored for that purpose. So if people find a trace of something in it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to cause any harm. So the idea that you would stop drinking water from the domestic water supply, in fact, switching to something else is probably more harmful than not.
So I'm hearing that a lot of important government level action is warranted. We've got a hand there. Yes, somebody get this lady a microphone.
I just have to come in at this moment because just spent most of the day at a meeting in Southampton about the expansion of the airport in Southampton. We've had two of the panel mention pollution from aeroplanes. They're expecting to increase. I don't know if anybody here is aware of this that's happening. If you aren't, then please, find out about it and object, because we need lots of objections very soon to stop it happening. So get yourselves involved. Look at Extinction Rebellion, a Facebook page, and you'll find out all about it. Or AXO. It's going to increase by, I think it's 3,500 tonnes per annum in the year 2037 by the increase of the flights. So I think it's something we really ought to be stopping. I mean, that's going to really affect health in Southampton. It's going to have a huge impact.
Thank you for your comment. Any other comments from the audience at this point? Yes, that lady at the top there. Keeping our microphone handlers fit.
You said that we should be looking at reliable sources before making decisions on this. How do we expect people to do that? There is so much information out there, and I'm pretty savvy, as in I've got a science-based degree, I read quite widely. It's still quite hard to discern what is important and what is fluff.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I'm not dismissing your question. I'm taking it as a comment, because I'm going to actually call our next question, which picks up on this theme, I think, which will give you an opportunity to respond to that. So Lewis Goff, Christ the King, where are you? All the way down the bottom.
How can you make individuals change their habits? Is social media the answer?
So, sort of picks up a little bit on the lady at the back asking about, how the hell do you make sense of all this information? Lewis is asking, how can you make individuals change their habits? Is social media the answer? Mary?
Well, I think the question or the comment from the back there has just answered that question for us. So social media, assuming that's one of the sources of information that you've been using, is clearly not the answer, because there's way too much out there. And I actually have generally a bit of an issue with the whole idea that this is an individual responsibility anyway. I mean, if we live in a world where we're going to die from being stressed about how to exclude pollutants and toxins from our environment before we can exclude toxins from our environment by our own individual choices and decisions, then clearly it's not all about individual choices and decisions, and we can't really put that on people to be as well informed as they can. I think, having said that, I think we have an individual responsibility to join forces to make a collective responsibility to resist all sorts of known issues, and I think the fact that we're expanding Southampton Airport in the face of trends in other countries like Sweden, which are reducing particularly internal flights, which many of Southampton's flights are, is a shocking thing to be doing, and I don't quite know why we think we're doing that, but we can argue that later. I think there's another question about... I'm going to let someone else answer this in a minute, I promise. There's another question about how do we make people change their behaviour? And I think the truth is we don't make people change their behaviour. I think people make themselves change their behaviour. People will change their behaviour if they wish to. And I think it is our job, if we have a job at all, to support people find reasons why they might want to change their behaviour. So people will change behaviour for their own reasons. And I will stop now, because I could go on for a long time.
I know because we're buddies on Twitter that, Shante, you tweet. What's your opinion about this? Is social media the answer? Is it the answer to making people change even if you can't change their habits?
I think social media is a really powerful tool that we can use. I don't think it's the sole answer. I think we need to join forces and do lots of different things. But social media has brought awareness to things like Meatless Monday. So that is individuals changing their actions, trying to consume less meat to obviously help with air pollution, carbon emissions, things like that. Also, since Greta Thunberg took her trip to New York City, there's been 21,000 more people joined a group to go in with sailboat hitchhiking. So people are trying to change their travel habits, and also social media is encouraging things like flight-free pledges and things like that to try and help toxins.
It sparks ideas, maybe. I mean, you come face to face with patients every day of your existence. Do you think you can change people's habits?
Doctors like to think they can, but they can't most of the time.
How very enlightened of you, Graham.
I think in life what you want is a lot of people saying the same thing and easy steps, which a number of which might get you to where you want to be. Coming back to social media, it's there, and I think quite a lot of us are actually on Twitter. Why I'm on Twitter? Because actually I quite like to get a sensible message out there to maybe push back against some of the nonsensical messages. I think what we have to do as individuals is actually decide who we trust. There's lots of really good universities in this country producing high quality research. I think most of that you can trust. Our government is generally okay, but it's usually 10 years behind where it should be. Internationally, other governments, so you look at President Trump, who doesn't believe in global warming. So you've got to choose your sources and follow them, and hopefully that will give you a sensible message.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello, stand up. My name's Adnan, I'm one of the doctors at the hospital. So the title of this lecture is Toxic Question Time. We've talked a lot about the elephant in the room and pollution in general, but we've not actually named any compounds or anything specifically that we should be worried about. Which compounds? Is it nitrous oxide? Is it methane? Is it carbon dioxide? Is it soot? What should be worried about? What are the main culprits that each of you think? And could we talk a little bit more about these micron level particles that pass straight into the bloodstream, because they seem a bit worrying? Thank you.
Thank you. Alan Boobis, would you like to make some comments on that? I don't think we can maybe do the entire panel.
Well,
but
I think if we start worrying about carbon dioxide as a human toxin, we're in serious trouble. The problem with carbon dioxide is more climate. It's mainly particles, as far as we're aware, and submicron particularly, or PM2.5s, and also, of course, the NOx and the SOx, the sulfur and nitrogen oxide gases, and there's increasing evidence that they're implicated in some of the effects of air pollution. Methane, again, is not a human health concern from the air, although it's a significant, of course, an important factor in climate change.
So there's some specifics. Does anybody like to add any further concerns?
I think all of the above in some ways. I think it depends on, there's the immediate impact on your health, and as Alan was saying, things like carbon dioxide won't directly impact your health. Some people on social media even say it's a healthy thing, bizarrely. But I mean, it's a question of is it an indirect toxin? So is it going to affect climate, which will then impact your health? So it's a very tricky one to single out. And you could pick any one as being a big problem. But it's the fact we're getting we're not being bombarded by any means. Alan said, there are plenty of toxins out there which are at such low level they're not going to do us any harm. But it is the stuff that we deal with every day. It's the common stuff that's the problem rather than the rare stuff. You might get some very interesting toxins in Salisbury occasionally, but the number of people who've died from that are fairly limited. Tough if you were the one, but I think if you look at the people who are dying from soot and that sort of thing, then that's a far more endemic thing.
We're going to. I looked at my watch 5 minutes ago and realised we're over 3/4 of the way through. Would you believe it? Doesn't time fly? But we're going to take a slight change in gear now, and I'm going to ask Sophie Brown of Peter Symonds College for her question, please. Sophie, where are you? There she is.
Yeah. As you know, it's quite a current trend. But would being vegan be better for the environment, or would it cause more health implications from not getting enough nutrients?
Debbie, actually, what's your thoughts on this?
That's a good question. I'm not an expert. I'll say it from a generalist perspective. So you may be familiar with the Eat Well plate, as when you're in primary school and they talk about your fruit and veg, and that has been revised, working with Public Health England and the British Dietetics Association. So it's an Eat Well guide now, in recognition that we want to be as sustainable as possible to support reduction in climate change, as well as supporting our health here and now. So I think there is recognition that being more vegan can help. I think if you look at the NHS guidance on going for a vegan diet, there are clearly some nutrients that you need to ensure that you get, like iron, B12 and calcium. And if you can't get that from your diet, it's through supplements. So there is recognition of your health now. You need to ensure that you get certain nutrients that you wouldn't necessarily get from a vegan diet in some other way, or by eating certain foods more. But I think more interestingly for me is the Eat Well plate becoming more sustainable as well. And being vegan means that you're reducing, obviously you haven't got red meat consumption as part of your diet, and that has such a big impact on carbon emissions when you look at food production overall from farm to fork.
Thank you. Alan, Boobis, do you have anything to add to that in terms of the environmental hit or relief?
Well, I think, as has been said, it's not a simple equation, because you've got to think about the totality of the impact. So if you grow vegetables which are going to feed the urban population of this country, then you've got to think of how much vegetables you've got to grow and how you're going to grow them successfully. And that means you've got to do something to the land to ensure productivity. That has an environmental impact. And so I think that one has to work out the exact cost globally. Could have a sustainable, environmentally friendly diet which was not necessarily purely vegan. So I'm thinking, for example, of sustainable aquaculture as a component of that.
Sustainable aquaculture.
Yeah, growing fish and shellfish, which are not depleting the global stocks, and there are ways to do that.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yes.
So what's the role of cow manure in creating sustainable farming? So we have,
there's been some research on this.
Thank you. Yes.
There's some research which was published. I mean, I live with a vegan, a vegetarian, a lactose intolerant, you name it. I eat anything. I think we probably do eat too much meat. There's no doubt about it. And I think there's a public opinion that people are entitled to have cheap meat. I think that's where we go wrong. I think mass-produced meat is a really bad thing. But there was an interesting piece of research that came out last year which showed that in terms of the farming, if you're going to grow vegetables, you also need ruminants to provide a sort of cycle of, if you like, natural manure and things. If you want to look at organic growth, then you need this mix of animal farming as well as growing vegetables. I think the key thing here is that people through choice, perfectly understandable choice, don't eat meat, and that's a good thing. And I think we can cut back the amount of meat we use enormously and make it far more sustainable. And there are many parts of the world where this is the case anyway. It's probably only places like Northwest Europe and the States where we have this demand for cheap chicken. You know, when I was a kid, chickens were very expensive. Nowadays, you pick them up, people complain if they're more than £2.50 an Asda, or other shops are available to us. There is a cycle, and you can't take one part of that farming cycle, which has been going since we started farming, you know, going back thousands of years. If you suddenly stop one part of that completely, if you banned sort of animals tomorrow from farms, then there'd be a knock-on effect. It's not just a simple question of stopping. You have to find some other way of growing the vegetables.
Yep, a quick comment if you can. Yep, thank you.
If the more of like the nation turned vegan, a lot is very more expensive, like the vegan diet. How could we like make it more available? Because like sustainable farming, like sustainable fish and stuff is like normally more expensive, and it's more like it's unavailable for like people with a lower income. So how could we make it more reasonable and more fair for everyone to afford it?
Quick comment. So who wants to take this one?
That's a tricky one.
Yeah.
I suppose there's national policies, there's taxes, so that's a way in which we could encourage. I'm not necessarily advocating that, but that's a method that can be used, because obviously money matters. I think local community farms, opportunities to work as local communities to support growing of vegetables is a fantastic way to encourage that. I think they would be my key ones.
Thank you. That's great. Of course, sometimes we turn to the oceans for our food, which segues me quite clunkily to our next question. Larissa Serban of St Anne's. Where are you? There she is.
If ocean microplastics can get into the food chain and our bodies, even potentially at critical early developmental stages, what does the panel think should be done?
I'm going to turn to you, Simon, again, actually. You know, ocean microplastics.
There are two questions there, really. The first question is, does it get into the food chain? And the second question is, does it do harm? It's interesting. There are 10, 15,000 papers, all peer-reviewed, on the impact of climate change. And we still have debates about, is climate change real? Is it happening? There are many politicians who say it doesn't. With plastics, the jury is still out in terms of the pure science. There's nothing good about plastic in the ocean. There's nothing good about plastic going into the system. If you'd ask a scientist that question 10 years ago, we'd probably say, well, it's sort of like roughage. It sort of goes through you and comes out the other end and doesn't really have an impact. One of the concerns is that plastics can act like sort of sponges. They can absorb toxins in the oceans, and they can then concentrate them, and then they get into the food chain. There is still research ongoing. There's a lot of research going on around the world at the moment. There is no firm conclusion yet. Now, it's a good thing to say, let's stop putting plastic in the ocean. There's no benefit, and there's certainly like to be harm. But we don't know the answer, and that's a sort of scientific. There's lots of opinion on social media, but the science facts at the moment are we're not really sure.
So in terms of, I mean, part of your question was, you know, critical stage of development, young bodies. Graham, do you have any thoughts on this? You know, what's your view?
Not specifically about plastics and the impact on the young human.
Any other the panellists have some insight on this in terms of the, you know, very early stages of development and anyone in the audience got something to shed?
Just had a question about that sort of last point about plastics and having effects on health. Are there any beliefs to what the health impacts of plastics could be on humans, or is there just no piece of evidence at all?
Would you like to say it? Yeah.
So as already been said, the reviews on the human health impact of microplastics, and there have been about 4 of them in the last 2 years, have all reached the same conclusion, which is at the moment there is no good evidence that they're having an impact, but there's an awful lot of research gaps. And one of the considerations is that they may have specifics such as absorption of toxins, but they're particles of a particular dimension or dimensions. And so we could get some indication of the likely effects by looking at what do other particles do. So I think there is a concern that if they're adding to the overall burden of particle exposure, then we can read across, if you like, from things like titanium dioxide or carbon microparticles, and think that at least is a baseline, and then do the studies to determine what else is going on, if anything.
Thank you.
There is one particular area which always worries people when they're dealing with particles, which is the fiber particle. So, you know, the asbestos story, long, thin fibers which are quite rigid, cause really aggressive cancer. And there was some evidence that synthetic fibers with similar dimensions could do the same things. So one of the concerns is that we are not being exposed to an excessive burden of fibrous particles. Now, I must say the evidence is against that at the moment, but it's something that there'll be more research on in the coming years.
Thank you so much. Jessica Pay from Portsmouth College, where are you? Can we have your question, please, to the panel?
What price are we going to pay to make solutions against toxins and climate change a reality?
What price are we going to pay? Debbie Chase.
Gosh, that's a big question. Oh, am I still on? Yeah. Yes. So, from a local authority perspective, so I was just thinking about it from, you have a finite amount of money, which is reducing year on year. You've got to think about the people that are in your city now and the challenges they face. We have a lot of children that are looked after, abuse, neglect. You look at social care, it's incredibly stretched. We want to encourage people to have good jobs, warm, safe homes, to get the education they need now. And then you've got the challenge of the future risk. And balancing that is incredibly difficult because you've got to think about those needs now and those future needs and what is the potential for those future needs or risks to be realised. So I think that's the trade-off in terms of that if we put more money and investment into the future, we're going to risk more people now with their crises and challenges now. And that's the trade-off.
Mary Barker.
So, well, the real point is that we're not going to be paying the price, right? It's going to be you guys and you guys' children who are going to be paying the price. So we have a responsibility to think about the price that's going to be paid, but we're not actually going to be paying it. And I think that the knowledge of that is obviously becoming wider and wider felt and understood, and I think explains the climate change action and Extinction Rebellion and the anger, the righteous and just anger that is being felt by younger generations about the price that we guys are making you guys pay. And I think that's entirely right and proper. And I want you all to get really, really angry and more angry. And I think that I don't think you should have to pay the price. I think there are other things you can do, and I think you guys have to do them. I think it's on you. I'm really sorry.
Afrin Rahman from Peter Symonds College, please.
As young people, what's the best thing that we can do to influence the politicians to reduce the levels of toxins in our environment?
So what is the best way for you to influence politicians to change your exposure to toxins? Shante Jackson.
Obviously, with like strikes, like Fridays for Future strikes, things like that, we've got Extinction Rebellion out on the streets trying to raise awareness. Apart from that, I think that's the main thing we can do. Obviously, the burden shouldn't be on us. We need to be in education in school and things like that, so it's hard to balance both of them. But it's important that we do go out and try and raise awareness. And we have seen, we've seen the government declare a climate emergency. We've had local councils declare a climate emergency. But it's important that they stick by this, and we need to make like rigorous targets, because at the moment it's carbon neutral by 2050, but we need to try and bring it down. And although some may argue that it's not realistic, it's important because we need to start making the changes now, so it's not too late.
Debbie, Chase, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah,
what are the best ways?
You're right, Shante. It's about that challenge, that opportunity to have a voice wherever you can. There are public council meetings and public cabinet meetings which you can attend. And equally, there's through the Green City Charter work in Southampton, there's a proposal that in the summer to set up a youth assembly. So you might want to get involved in that, to have a strong voice in what we do for the future.
Sorry.
As soon as you turn 18, vote.
Exactly.
Please. Are any of the younger members of the orders part of this youth assembly already?
Somebody,
Yes. Are you making a comment? Yep.
Where can we as younger people draw the line at having our voices heard but being detrimental? Because recently in Alton there was graffiti about climate change just over buildings, over the local community centre, and surely that's not going to help that much. It was just like, take action now, organise, activate, encourage, and it wasn't helpful. It was on public property. So surely there needs to be a line somewhere between getting our voice heard.
So there's but it could go too far. Shante, what are your feelings about this?
I feel that there's a lot of arguments going to link. It's the same with Extinction Rebellion when they're like blocking roads and things like that. But I think the main point is to raise awareness, so it gets in the newspaper, so that the local council governments have to use their resources to remove the graffiti, so that hopefully they'll meet us in the middle and actually take action, because they don't want these things to continue they don't want us to continue to graffiti or block roads or cause disruption to them. So for them to make a change, we have to get them angry.
Okay. Are there other thoughts on this in the audience? How does that seem to you? You sit on panels advising about these kind of things. How important and what is the best way for young people, do you think, to do you agree with your colleagues at the end here, your fellow panellists?
Well, I'm into my 8th decade, so I've been around for a while. And I think that it's a difficult argument to make that the end justifies the means. Right. And that's partly what's being argued here. I believe in the rule of law. I also believe in natural justice. So I think that society as a whole has to decide in which direction it wishes to go. And one way to do that is the ballot box. And I think that one of the things we could do is get politicians who are more attuned to what people want and what the policies they want to be standing for election, and to make sure that the government of the day, whoever it is, does deliver the policies that the majority of people wish.
I'm going to bring Shante back again, because you've just been on BBC this week talking about this very issue, though.
Yes.
How old are you?
I'm 17.
Right,
so
and what's the problem here?
Obviously, we can't have the vote, so I definitely understand you need people to be standing who can make this difference. But it is, a lot of the time, it's like the 16, 17-year-olds at the moment that are really engaged with the climate strikes and things like this, and the current situation. So we don't have the vote. So if the voting age maybe was lowered, we have the opportunity to have our vote heard, to elect somebody who will represent what we actually believe. So then we wouldn't have to go to these measures for this to happen.
Yes.
So could I just say then, in response, I'm sympathetic, and I think that if 16, 17-year-olds have a legitimate view, which they do, then the answer is to lower the voting age to 16.
Thank you. The lady with the necklace.
Recently, a few weeks or months ago, Southampton Council had a survey from the Labour Council to ask the citizens of the city what they thought about the impact on banning diesel, limiting the access to certain vehicle into the city, maybe put a fee like they have in London. And the survey came back that the people of Southampton thought it was too expensive for them to do that. So it's all very good to have politicians who ask you for advice. That's great, you know, voting, blah, blah, blah. But also, people have got to understand that they have to make themselves an effort to change. So, you know, you can't have it both ways, basically. That's just what I'm trying to say. You know, voting young people is great, but are they willing to change themselves? Are we willing to change ourselves?
Thank you.
That's just you know,
Thank you.
it's not easy.
Yeah. You look like you're about to put your hand up there. No? Any other comments? Would you like to pick up on that, Debbie?
Yeah, absolutely. So last summer we had a consultation on clean air zone, and the proposal was essentially to bring in charging on certain policies, and that was under a ministerial requirement to do that piece of work. Alongside the consultation, we were required to do some modelling to look at emissions and what impact that would have and whether we would exceed the EU targets. The modelling showed that the things that we were doing, and we're implementing cycle infrastructure, all sorts of other bits and pieces, if you look at the City Council website, meant that we would be compliant by a certain point, and the Minister was confident with that. The consultation, as you say, there was a lot of public support for measures and really encouraging to tackle air pollution and seeing it as a priority, which is brilliant. It was balancing that also with the businesses and what the businesses were saying across the city about the influence and impact it would have on them and the jobs of the individuals that work within those businesses. And the decision was at the end of that process by the Minister to not take forward that chargeable congestion zone. However, a lot more work has gone on across the city, which is really encouraging, on that cycle infrastructure, the electric hookup points for vehicles, changing the fleet so it's low emission, buses, taxis, lots and lots of work, and sustainable distribution centres set up. So we reduce the amount of movement across the city. So I'm encouraged there's a lot of work going on in the city, but you're right, there is a balance here again, and it goes back to what I was saying before about balancing jobs with the challenge that we face.
Okay,
a quick comment, yeah?
Yes, about the port, for example. Southampton is a city that lives with boats and cargo at the centre. Now, in the UK and in Southampton, the boats come and belch out 24/7, as long as they're in the harbour, fuel which is the dirtiest of everything, okay? And Southampton ABP, the port authorities, have refused systematically to have a plug-in that is a system that brings in electricity so the boats do not have to burn that fuel, but can plug and pay, of course, more money to get the electricity from the port. A lot of big harbour in Europe have implemented that. Why is it that a city like us are not able to push those companies? And I know that it might be a national action, because obviously if we become too expensive, they will go somewhere else. I mean, surely there is some work to be done.
What is stopping the city from pushing those companies to take that serious action? I mean, I'm not sure whether you've got a...
Council's doing a lot in terms of having a green city charter, getting organisations to sign up with it, working closely with the port. So the port has produced a strategy which is on their website of ways in which they'll reduce risk and reduce emissions. And one of those proposals is in relation to an electric hookup point at the port. I don't know the current status of that, but they do recognise and understand the need to move forwards on those proposals. I think you're right, there's something about, again, as we were talking earlier, about what we do internationally and nationally to make sure that it's a fair process so that it has that minimal impact on jobs, because jobs equals health as well. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yep.
Right.
So they're putting forward 3, but it is being discussed at the moment.
Thank you. Okay. One final quick comment from...
Thanks. I know
I believe we've heard from you before. You do, you're on fire.
Personal comments. I know in Malmö, there's in a place in Sweden, they do 100% renewable energy, and they actually prioritise cyclists at the lights. So when a cyclist comes past, the lights not instantly, but always turn green more favourably than cars. So it's actually increased so much more active transport. Do you think this could be a possibility in Southampton?
Oh, I love that idea.
It's
one I will take back for consideration. It's a really good one.
Thank you very much. Now, horrifically, I'm looking at my watch. It's almost 7:10, which means that we are almost at the end of this question time discussion for tonight. But there is time for one last question from Sophie Bruce from Christ the King College. Sophie, can we get this woman a microphone, please? Yeah.
What is your most toxic habit?
What is your most toxic habit, Simon?
Thanks for starting with me.
I'm simply going from one end to the
depends
other.
whether you ask me or my wife, I suppose. What's my most toxic habit? I have an admission to make. I drive a diesel car.
Oh.
And I went to diesel at the time when we were going away from petrol. And I will get rid of my diesel car soon, but being a poor academic, I can't afford to yet. So I guess my most toxic habit, being realistic, is the fact I do drive a diesel car, but I do take trains when I can. It comes back to the problem, someone was talking earlier about planes. If we had trains that ran comfortably, like they do in Sweden, a couple of years ago, I was doing some work for the university, and Brussels airport was bombed, sadly, and so we ended up having to take a train from Brussels to Milan. It was about the same price as the train out off-peak from Southampton to London, but it went from Brussels to Milan. I travelled first class at that price as well, and it was on time, it was comfortable, and it was a delight. You had internet on board. So actually, I would get rid of my toxic habits if we had a better system in this country.
Yeah, sounds good. Alan Boobis. What is your most toxic habit?
I switched to Eurostar to go to Brussels 3 or 4 years ago, around the same time when Brussels airport was having difficulties. But I guess it's a toss-up between driving a petrol-fueled car and flying around the world.
Okay. Dear.
Not in a private plane. I don't own just in regular economy
You're better than the
airlines.
So, having always driven a petrol car, I also succumbed to the government pressure about 5 to 10 years ago and changed to diesel. So I've got a car that's about 5 to 10 years old. It's not at the end of its life. What do? Do I scrap it? And how much impact does that have on the environment? So I'm waiting for my diesel car to be a little bit older and then get myself an electric when they're affordable.
Okay. Yeah. Mary Barker, what is your most toxic
So
habit?
so many toxic habits. This is a little bit like listening to this. It's a little bit. Remember that game where you go, I went to the supermarket and I bought.
Yes.
Blah, blah, wow. Okay, so I drive a diesel car, really old one. I fly,
and an old one as well.
I fly around the world far more than I should. But I think probably, just to ring the changes a little bit, I live in an old house, which is not very well insulated, which has very high ceilings, which we have to run the heating out a lot higher than we should have. When I stand on a ladder, my head gets really hot near the ceiling, but my toes are really cold near the floor. It has big drafty windows. It has drafty windows. So it's probably my most toxic hobby, is my house, which I do love, but which is really expensive to run.
Yeah, I have to agree. For me, it would be flying as well. I try and reduce everything as I can. I don't eat meat, dairy. I take public transport wherever I can. But flying, I really do want to experience the world. And so.
And Debbie?
Well, for me, it's the petrol car. But I must say, I'm fortunate enough that I live at where I can cycle to work, which is brilliant. But I've got to say, the last few days have been absolutely freezing on my bike. I've been tempted, as I have today, to use the car. So I'm trying my hardest to ensure that I cycle and take the train as much as possible. But it's too easy to use our cars.
There was I'm going to let you because I know you and
Do any of you offset your flights, for example?
Now come on, you flying, you ones who've confessed about flying. Do you offset? No? Well, there's an action point from this evening. Yeah.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
That's a really good point.
Thank you. Good. It's always nice to end on an up note of, advice. I think that's great. In view of time, we are going to stop the discussion, but I'd like to thank, firstly, you, the audience, for some fantastic questions and for really chipping in. You've been brilliant, but also in stimulating answers from our fantastic panel of experts. I'd like to give a round of applause to you. Thank you.